a little bit about yourself. You've been in internal communications for 25 plus years. You've worked at Barclays, Royal Mail, Virgin Media. You have written or developed a training program for internal communicators that has been completed by 4,000 plus practitioners. And you just wrote your book. So maybe just if you want to add something a little bit about your background for us.
I think that's a really good summary, actually. And probably one of the things I like about internal communications is people come to it from all kinds of different places. It's like this really nice melting pot. And I guess I'm quite unusual in that I've stayed in it. So I did my degree in communication studies. I worked in-house for about 13 years and then came out and fell into training and discovered that I like it. So I'm still completely fascinated by communication and especially by how our brains work and what makes people tick.
And I know you're studying that a bit more at the moment, right?
Behavioral science,
yeah,
absolutely.
We talked about this as well because a lot of internal communications people right now, or I've seen a lot of people talking about how people tend to fall into those roles, but that's absolutely not the case for you. So I thought that was also interesting.
Yeah, I stayed in it. I think the thing I love about communication is, to me, every new project is like having a new jigsaw puzzle. So, every time it's a different problem that needs to be solved with a different group of people. And so to me, you can never get bored because every time I'm always thinking, well, what's the answer this time? I never go into a project thinking, well, I've been doing this for 25 years. I can see the answer straight away. I still can't. I still every time go in thinking, right, what are my objectives? What are the audience groups? How do I solve this one?
So why training versus maybe consulting or in-house? Why was it that the specific area that you just kind of found yourself in?
I think I've been in-house for 13 years and just before I'd left, I've been through a really big set of changes. So to be honest, after the big set of changes, everyday communications felt, dare I say it, just a tiny little bit dull. So I wanted to get out and I did start consultancy. But I think what really got me into training is I tried to buy training in-house for our leaders and I couldn't buy it. I could either buy communications consultancies who didn't really train, or I could buy training companies that didn't really know communication, but I couldn't buy both. And I really wanted to buy both. I got the training team in the room and me in the room and we just couldn't spend the money. So I thought, well, I'd quite like to buy the thing that I couldn't get. And I was in headquarters in the end for a long time, and I like being in a room with people at the front line. Yeah. I missed in my job being in a factory or a call centre or a processing plant. Yeah. And in a training room, I get to meet internal comms people all the time, and I really like that.
So you've decided to write your book on employee communications versus internal communications. So why did you decide to go for employee comms?
We thought about it quite carefully, actually. So we've used the two terms interchangeably in the book. But the reason we chose that one is, first of all, I think there's something quite special about employees as an audience group. I think they've grown in importance over recent years. So we can see, for example, that they're very trusted as a source of information about companies. To me, employees are the people who make companies work or not. They're the ones that deliver service to customers. I've had people turn up at my house and do maintenance work or jobs, and I find the conversations and the things they say about their companies so interesting. I kind of sit there and think, wonder how your company would feel if they knew you were talking about them like that. So I think there's something very special about employees as a group. And I also think the lines between internal and external communication are now very blurred. So it could be, for example, that you want to reach your employees, but you do that through an external communication channel. Maybe it's an external social media channel. Yeah. Maybe you really want a group of people to feel recognised, so you do a series of articles in the external media. So to me, the boundaries between internal and external are blurred, but still employees are a very distinct and a very special audience.
Yeah, and I think there are so many different titles and companies are structured so differently when it comes to communications that it's just interesting to, honestly, when I find some kind of definition to a term, I just want to grab it and stick to it because there's not a lot. We recently did a blog post on what is internal communication. We asked 16 experts for their answers. And to be honest, I was a bit surprised with how well it resonated with internal communicators, because it turns out it is actually not only my question as a marketer, but it's a big question out there. Everybody had slightly different views on it, and the cool thing was to find the common ground a little bit. But since I have you here, I have to ask, what is internal communication to you?
Oh, that's really mean, because I just want to ask you what everybody else said. I think we've got a whole chapter in the book actually about how to define internal communications. I think what makes it special to me is, on the one hand, it's about the employees, so it's about how we make it easy for them to do their jobs, how we help them feel part of the organisation they work with, how we help them understand how they fit and have meaning and purpose in their work. And the other side of it is we use internal communication or employee communication to help organisations achieve results. I think communication it's an enabler. It's an enabler that helps organisations work better.
Nice. So you've been in this space for a long time, 25 plus years. What I'm curious to understand is, what are some of the big changes that you've seen over the years, and then maybe even some big trends that you see right now? Because I think that just the experience will, at least in marketing, I see a little bit of that. When you've been in it for a little bit of time, you start to see these fads kind of coming in and out. So I'm interested to see some of the big changes you've noticed, and if there are any trends that you see right now.
Mm-hmm. I think in terms of changes, it's the tools that we have available. So I'm going to make myself sound really old and say that when I started in internal communication, there was no technology. I literally employed a team of people whose job it was to put letters in envelopes. So I always say to people, you think it's hard to get a seat at the table and be valued in your job. It's even harder when people know you as the lickers and stickers. That's what we were called, lickers and stickers of envelopes. So since I started, there's always been a new thing. There was email. Email was going to change the world. And then there was internet. Internet was going to change the world. And then we had social media. And probably will sound very strange now that I used to stand at the front of training rooms having conversations like, now, what is a blog? Has anyone heard of a wiki? Yeah. And now we have digital, of course. So I think in one sense, we're in a complete golden age of possibilities. We can connect across geographies, time zones. We can give people a voice. We can genuinely have conversations online. We can make leaders more human. At the same time, I think we have to be very careful that we don't get carried away with new shiny things. And that our job doesn't become about, now communication is all about, I must have social media, or digital is the next new thing. I think to me, everything has to start with, what's the problem you're trying to solve here? All these things are tools. They're a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves.
So there are a couple questions that come to mind. The first one is, along those lines, what is the role of technology in employee communications? It's
an enabler. So, literally, I used to look after 21,000 people, and every time I wanted to communicate to all of them, I had to print 21,000 letters, put them in 21,000 envelopes, and put stamps on them, and send them through the processing system. Now, how easy is it, to put it through an app, to put it on email or whatever? Sometimes almost too easy, because I think it means we used to have to think about it really hard before we did it. Sometimes we don't think as much as we should, but the good thing, it has made our jobs a lot easier and enabled us to do things we couldn't do before. You talked a little bit before this morning when we were talking about the challenge that you faced when email first came out to, go from just post to getting people to adopt email. I thought that was, you can see that same kind of pattern as new technologies come around. But the other question that I wanted to ask related to that is that I think communicators really want to be seen, and they really need to be seen as a strategic group within their organizations. What I mean by that is that a lot of times they are seen as the newsletter senders or the party planners, and you have a much bigger job in front of you. And I find that it can be
maybe challenging to make that transition. So what would you say are some tips to help communications professionals go from that being more on the newsletters and really tactical to becoming a very strategical partner for the business?
That's a good question. I think if you look at the academic definitions of strategic communication, they'll talk about using communication for a purpose, for which I mean a business purpose. And back, 20 years ago, a guy called Bill Quirk invented this term outputs versus outcomes. And his point was that communicators, we tend to focus a lot on outputs. So, somebody comes to you and says, I want some help with this. And instantly a communicator thinks, oh, I've got 5 things that will help you with that. Yeah. And our mind goes into creating these solutions because we like creating solutions. It's helpful to offer solutions. Yeah. But outcomes focus says, well, you've kind of got to really find out what the problem is you need to solve before you start trying to offer solutions for it, which sounds obvious when you say it. And I think the key to that really is asking questions, which people can be quite frightened about because they don't want to be seen as difficult. Yeah. But I think if we ask good questions, beginning with the words what or how, what does success look like for you in business terms? What is it you want people to do differently as a result of this communication? These help us to understand what are we really trying to achieve here, and it's only then that you can say, okay, now let's look at the best tools to do that. We're a bit too quick to offer solutions.
But that was an interesting part in the session with the team today, because when you said that, our marketing team or product team, everybody was like, I can totally relate to that in my own area. It also is about asking those questions and figuring out what outcome you're trying to achieve. One question I wanted to ask you was actually related to that one. It's not so much a question, but you have a really good example in your book that I've been using it a lot when I'm having conversations internally, which is about the accident rate example of exactly that, outputs versus outcomes. Mm-hmm. Do you mind sharing a little bit of that? Because I think it's just brilliant.
Yeah. It was an example in the book where this particular organisation had asked an agency to raise awareness about key safety points. And it was a good comms agency, and they came back and said, well, can you help us understand a bit more about the problem you're trying to solve? So when you say key safety points, what's the problem that you've got with safety? What behaviours do you need to change? And the organisation said, oh, here's our safety data, have a look. And the agency looked at the data and came back and said, well, we still can't actually see a pattern here. What is it you need to get people to do differently to get these accidents to stop? Can we talk to your people and see what they say? So they went out to the people, and what they found is that people were actually really well informed about safety. They knew all the rules. They were quite passionate about it. So if you asked them how they felt about safety, they would really genuinely say, it is really important. I think about it all the time. So now they're thinking, well, what's the problem? Why do we need to communicate? So the last thing, finally in desperation, they said was, well, can we talk to some people who were in these accidents that you've had? And that's when they found the answer, because they found that in every one of these cases of accidents, they'd happened in a particular context. And the context was up against a tight deadline with a big commercial contract at stake. And in those instances, people hadn't even thought about safety. So it wasn't that they, deliberately didn't follow a rule or they didn't care. They were so focused on the deadline, so focused on the contract, it completely went out of their head, and they just did anything they could to make it happen. And once they found out that was the problem they needed to solve, of course that starts giving you solutions about how to solve it. So, you don't need to keep blasting everyone with things about safety. You need to find those particular situations and think, what's the right message? How do we get people to think about it on those occasions? And yet, it would have been the easiest thing in the world to take a brief that says, raise awareness about safety, and go out there with videos, safety days, posters, spend a fortune before you know it, and that would not have solved the problem.
Yeah. I love that example. There was something else that came up in the session earlier today, which was this concept of, how do you engage employees with giving them, using internal comms to also give them meaning and purpose at work. Yeah. That you shared maybe do you remember what I'm talking about? The one that ends up with the church.
Oh, I do. The stonemason.
Yes, I just love that. I need to get that on video. It was too good.
Absolutely. So we talk sometimes in communication about the idea of line of sight, which means that wherever you are in the organisation, you can see that connection between your job and something bigger. So you're not just making money for shareholders. And so it's the story of the 3 stonemasons. And the person goes up to the first stonemason and says, "What are you doing? What's your job?" And the stonemason says, "Well, you can see what I'm doing. You know, I'm hacking away at this great hefty lump of stone. It's really hard work." And the person goes to the second stonemason and says, "Well, what are you doing?" He's doing exactly the same thing. And the second stonemason says, "Well, I'm building a wall," which probably sounds a bit better than the stone. And then he goes to the third person doing exactly the same job and says, "What are you doing?" And the third stonemason says, "I'm helping to build a cathedral." And that's the whole idea of kind of meaning, purpose, line of sight. Do you feel that you're just coming into work day after day, you know, pushing papers, doing a difficult job, or do you feel as if you're a part of something bigger?
Yeah, I love that. You know, there's so much talk about the concept of employee engagement, and I thought that was a really good way to put it. One thing I wanted to ask you is that clearly the role of the CEO is super important in employee communications. Now, most CEOs don't necessarily feel like that's their job. So do we need to inspire some kind of culture change with the CEO?
I think it's an interesting question. I think if you asked any CEO whether communication is important, they would say yes. And my question, I guess, whenever I hear communicators say that leaders are making their life difficult, I hear it a lot, is to say, well, we can't always change other people, but we can change ourselves. So what is it about the conversations we might be having with those leaders that we can change? So, for example, I work with my best ever leader in one organisation. Not at the start. First time I met him, I sat and read the paper, but things got better. He was fantastic to work with. I got really emotional on the day he left. And I had coffee with him after he'd been in his new organisation for a while. And I said, "How are you getting on with your comms person?" And he said, "Terrible." And I said, "Beg your pardon?" "Why?" And he said to me at the time, "You know, I look in my diary at the start of the day and the meetings fall into kind of 3 categories. One is, God, it's going to be a tough meeting. You know, it's a difficult challenge we've got about sales or costs or whatever. The second is, I'm looking forward to that one. That's going to give me some solutions around whatever business problem." And then he said, "I have a third category that is a bit meh." And I said, "What do you mean, meh?" And he said, "Well, you know, take communication that everybody else is coming in talking about sales, costs, production, whatever. This person comes in and says, only 20% of people read the intranet this week. And, you know, 50% of people had a briefing with their line manager. You know," and he said, he wanted the connection to be made to the business. And, you know, he was not a difficult leader. I had worked with that guy. He was the best leader I've ever worked with. And he was not the problem. You know, it was about making that connection again to the business and not just going in there talking about communication tactics.
So I know from our conversations earlier that one of your roles was kind of being the person delivering bad news. And I think, unfortunately, that's a part of communications. And maybe even when communications is most important, like to have a plan, a strategy at the times where you need to be sharing not so good news, is probably a very crucial part of a good internal communication strategy. So can you maybe share some tips on how to share the bad news?
For me, bad news is they're kind of a moment of truth. So I think even if it is awful news, the way it's handled can make that difference between how people feel about the organisation afterwards, and even how the people around them feel as well. So I think one good thing about that CEO I just mentioned was his motto was "Tell it as it is." I think, you know, be honest, tell the truth. I think sometimes we can be too good at wibbly words and, you know, not quite giving the answers to questions. Tell it as it is, focus on what it actually means to people, rather than making them sit through hours of context and markets and blah, blah. And another thing I think is people want to know that you care. So what can you do to show that you care? And it can be small things. So I remember one organisation I worked with, we were closing some buildings. We were also putting some new computers into buildings. We were reducing numbers in other buildings. And we'd done some videos about this whole kind of changes and the computer systems and everything. And we had this big debate about, well, what about the people that are leaving? You know, will it annoy them if we get them to sit through a video for something that they won't be here for? Or will they be left out if we don't give them the chance? So for those sites, we recorded a specific introduction on those videos to say, look, we've thought really carefully about those of you that are leaving, you know, because we don't want you to feel left out and just don't automatically exclude you. At the same time, we don't want to be insensitive that this is a system that you don't want to see. So you're here because we've thought about you and we want to give you the choice. If you'd like to stay and watch this, you're very welcome. If you feel like, no, it doesn't feel like the right time and you'd prefer to, you know, go and have a coffee, go back to your desk, that's fine too. And we got a lot of kind of plaudits for that, just because it was a simple thing to do. It was maybe 30 seconds per site, but it just showed people that we thought about them. We thought about them.
So Sue, it's been such a pleasure getting to know you. Thank you so much for making the trip. I'm really excited that we were able to make this happen so quickly. I want to finish off with one last question. In one sentence, what would be the one piece of advice that you would give to communicators out there who are trying to make a difference in their organizations?
Oh, that's a hard one to finish on. The one piece of advice. I've already talked about outputs versus outcomes, or I'd say that. So if I give another piece of advice, I would say, if you don't spend time with your audience groups, go out there and spend a bit of time with them. I think employee communicators like to think they know their audiences. I like to put a little test to people sometimes, where it's literally a tick box that asks them what they know, and people are usually really shocked about how much or how little they know. So I'd say if you're spending too much time at your desk or in headquarters, maybe get out there and spend a bit more time, find out what it's really like in your organisation.
I mean, you've talked about that earlier today as well, which is, maybe you had a funny example, which is, go talk to marketing. They've done a really good job of getting to know their audience, maybe IC can learn a little bit from them. I thought it was a good parallel, but it also, it should be much easier to get to know your own people than an external audience, right?
Yeah, I think our natural partners, and they are great partners for communicators, are HR. And HR, great data about employees. A lot of it tends to be demographics. And I think marketers are really good at thinking about, for example, external segmentation, about putting together consumer profiles, customer profiles. And I think we can be surprised by the different perspective that people in marketing can give us. So I think, chat to the people in HR, chat to the people in marketing, see what lessons you can get from each of them that we can bring about getting to know not just demographics of the audience, but actually what people care about, their attitudes. That's what makes people choose to pay attention to your communication.
Well, I can say that as a marketer, I have done nothing but learn from internal communicators in the last year. And the last few hours here have been great. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. And it's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you.